The lantern's flame sputtered, a dying heart of fire, as the tower shuddered against the howl of the sea. Wind tore at the iron rail, and the glass of the lantern room cracked, spiderwebbing into 1,000 shards that fell like cold rain onto the stone floor. A scream, half human, half wind, ripped through the night, echoing off the walls in a chorus of grief that seemed to rise from the very bricks. Shadows twisted on the spiral stair, the silhouettes of 2 small figures gliding upward, their hands outstretched, their mouths forming a wordless lament. The last keeper, Thomas Whitaker, stood at the base of the stairs, his face a mask of ash and remorse, his voice a ragged whisper that fell into the void. "Forgive me." A flash of lightning illuminated the tower's cracked windows, and the beam of the revived lantern cut through the black, striking the sea with a thin line of white that seemed to pull the darkness back into the abyss. The wind fell silent, as if the ocean itself held its breath. Then, as quickly as it had risen, the storm receded, and the tower stood still, empty, the only sound the distant roll of waves and the faint echo of a lullaby that drifted on the breeze. Dr. Elena Marlowe brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, the early morning sun spilling through the lab's tall windows. The hum of the refrigeration units was a comforting backdrop to the soft clink of glass vials as she recorded the final measurements of the coral sample she had spent weeks collecting off the coast of Key West. Her notebook lay open on the bench, pages filled with neat, precise handwriting, each line a testament to the methodical world she had built around herself: data, graphs, conclusions. The world outside was bright, the ocean a sheet of glass, the gulls wheeling lazily above the pier. She smiled at the thought of the upcoming conference, the chance to present her findings on reef regeneration. The routine was a balm: coffee at 8, a quick walk to the pier, the rhythmic splash of waves against the hull of the research vessel, the steady pulse of the sea's tide. Elena's life was a series of predictable beats, each day a measured step toward a future she could map on paper. Her phone buzzed on the bench, a message flashing across the screen: "Team meeting tonight, St. Augustine Lighthouse. Bring equipment. Rumors are interesting." The name sent a faint ripple through her composure. The lighthouse was a relic she'd only ever seen in photographs, its silhouette a dark crown against the horizon, a place whispered about in the local taverns as haunted, as cursed. Elena laughed quietly, shaking her head. She was a scientist, not a believer in ghost stories. Yet curiosity, that stubborn ember, had begun to glow. She slipped the phone into her pocket, the message a small stone in the pocket of her mind. The day continued, the lab's fluorescent lights hummed, colleagues chatted about the upcoming storm season, and Elena's thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the lighthouse's stone stairs, to the echo of a lullaby she could not yet hear. The sea outside whispered, a low murmur that seemed to call her name, promising secrets hidden in the darkness. By late afternoon, Elena packed her bag: cameras, audio recorders, a portable spectrometer, items that would become tools for a night that would shatter the calm of her measured existence. She paused at the door, feeling the cool draft of the hallway, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the walls breathing in a rhythm she could not name. She turned the knob, stepped out into the bright afternoon, and the scent of salt and seaweed filled her lungs, as if the ocean itself were preparing her for the descent into the tower's stone heart. She did not yet know that the lighthouse would become a mirror, reflecting the shadows of a past that refused to stay buried, that the faint cries of 2 forgotten girls would climb the spiral stair and pierce the veil of her rational mind. The night ahead would blur the line between research and nightmare. And the lighthouse's ancient stone would hold her story in its cold, unyielding grip. Elena Whitfield rose before the sun, as she always did, the thin light of dawn slipping through the cracked shutters of the modest cabin that clung to the cliffs like a weather-worn barn. She moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years cataloging the quiet corners of the world: a kettle boiled, the steam curling like a ghost's breath, she measured the coffee with a spoon, the bitter dark liquid a small promise of steadiness for the day ahead. Her notebook lay open on the small wooden table, pages half filled with observations from the previous night's tide watch, the rhythm of the waves noted in careful, looping script. A thin line of ink traced the edge of a tide gauge, the numbers rising and falling like the pulse of the sea itself. She dressed in layers, wool sweater, weatherproof jacket, boots that had seen more sand than pavement, each garment a shield against the salty wind that never ceased its whisper along the bluff. Before stepping outside, she checked the equipment that would become her companions, a compact audio recorder with a microphone fine enough to catch the sigh of a distant gull, a handheld spectrometer that glowed faintly when it brushed against mineral deposits, and a set of infrared lenses she kept tucked in the inner pocket of her coat. Every tool was placed with the same reverence she gave to a surgeon's instruments, for she knew that the lighthouse would demand more than curiosity, it would demand proof, and proof required patience. The path down to the lighthouse was a narrow ribbon of stone, slick with sea spray, winding past jagged rocks that rose like the teeth of an ancient beast. Elena's boots clicked against the granite, each step echoing in the hollow that the wind had carved into the cliffside. The air was sharp, scented with brine and the faint, sweet rot of kelp. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries cutting through the silence, and the distant roar of the Atlantic seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. When she reached the iron-bound gate of the St. Augustine Light, the metal creaked a low, mournful note as she pushed it open. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a blackened stone tower that had once cut a bright line across the night sky, now scarred by years of neglect. Its lantern room, once a beacon of hope for wandering ships, sat dark and empty, the glass panes clouded with the dust of abandonment. Vines clung to the lower walls, their tendrils weaving through cracks, as if trying to reclaim the stone for the earth. Elena paused at the foot of the spiral staircase, her eyes tracing the worn steps that curled upward like a serpent. The stone was cold under her fingertips, each tread marked by the erosion of countless storms. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the tower settle around her, a silent guardian of stories that had never been told. Her recorder buzzed softly in her pocket, a reminder that she was here to listen, to capture the whispers that the wind might carry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp plaster and the faint metallic tang of rust. She lit a lantern, an old oil lamp she had brought for the night, its flame trembling as it fought the draft that slipped through the cracks in the walls. The light flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the spiraled stair, turning each stone into a moving portrait of the past. She began her routine with a careful sweep of the main chamber. The keeper's desk, a sturdy oak slab scarred by time, still held a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and softened by the sea's humidity. Elena lifted it gently, the pages rustling like dry leaves. The ink inside was faded, the handwriting tight and deliberate. She turned to the most recent entry, the date barely legible, October 12, 1947. The words were brief, a note of weather and a mention of a fire that had threatened the lantern. A line beneath it caught her eye, "The girl's laughter haunts the stairs when the wind sighs." A shiver traveled down her spine, though the lantern's glow held the darkness at bay. She had heard the story before, whispered among locals who spoke of the twins, Amelia and Clara, who had vanished in a storm decades ago. The tale was often told in half-light taverns, the words drifting like smoke, a ship wrecked upon the reef, two orphan sisters taken in by the keeper, a night of raging waves, and then silence. Some claimed the girls had been lost to the sea, others whispered that the keeper, in a moment of terror, had hidden them within the stone walls. The rumors were as thin as the sea mist, but they lingered, clinging to the lighthouse as tenaciously as the vines to its base. Elena set the journal aside, careful not to disturb any loose pages. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, the pen poised above the paper. "First observation," she wrote, "the interior temperature is markedly lower than the outside, despite the lantern's flame. The stone retains a chill that seems to emanate from the stairwell itself. Notable acoustic anomaly, faint, rhythmic tapping heard from the upper levels when the wind reaches a certain pitch." She paused, listening. The wind outside rose, a low moan that seemed to echo the cadence of a child's lullaby, though no melody formed fully in her mind. A soft creak resonated from the stairwell, a single step landing on stone that was not her own. Elena's breath caught. She turned the lantern toward the source, the beam cutting a thin column of light that fell upon the darkened steps. Nothing moved, yet the air felt heavier, as if the tower itself exhaled a sigh. She recorded the sound, the faint tap followed by a faint, distant hum that might have been a child's voice, or merely the wind threading through the cracks. The recorder captured a low, mournful tone, a sound that would later be described by the team as the echo of a lullaby half forgotten. Elena closed her notebook, her mind already cataloging the sensations, the temperature, the faint sounds. She rose, her routine now altered by the subtle hint that the tower held more than stone and salt. The lighthouse, she realized, was a vessel of memory, and its walls were ready to speak. With a final glance at the journal, she descended the spiral stair, each step a measured beat in the rhythm of a story that had waited centuries to be heard. The night fell thick over the broken stone, a black veil stitched with the distant roar of surf and the occasional cry of gulls that seemed to mourn rather than call. Elena stood at the base of the spiral stair, the lantern in her hand a feeble candle against the darkness that pressed in from every angle. The research team had set up their equipment in the lower chambers, microphones clamped to rusted iron, a recorder humming low on a cracked wooden table, and a notebook open to a page half filled with hurried observations. Yet the tower itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. A wind began to stir, thin at first, slipping through the cracked shutters and rattling the panes of glass that still clung to the lantern room far above. It carried a scent of salt and something older, a faint perfume of damp wool and ash that curled around Elena's throat. She tightened her grip on the lantern, the oil flickering, casting a wavering circle of amber on the stone steps. The circle grew, then shrank, as if the light were breathing. She lifted her recorder and pressed the button, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the hollow tower. The microphone, perched on a rusted rail, caught a faint tap, one solitary footfall on stone, soft as a whisper, followed by a low, humming murmur that seemed to rise from the very walls. Elena's skin prickled. She turned the lantern toward the source, the beam slicing through the gloom like a blade of fire. The stairs stretched upward in a perfect, endless spiral, each step a cold slab of granite worn smooth by the countless feet that had trod them over the centuries. The light fell on the first few steps, then disappeared into the darkness beyond. For a heartbeat she saw nothing but the black void, but then, at the second turn of the spiral, a shape materialized. It was not a figure of flesh, but a thin, translucent outline that hovered just above the stone, its edges shimmering like heat above a flame. Two silhouettes stood side by side, their forms faint and wavering, as if caught in a perpetual sigh. Elena's breath caught in her throat, the air grew colder, the lantern's flame flickering as though a breath of winter had passed over it. The apparitions were small, childlike, their heads tilted toward each other in a silent conversation. Their faces were indistinct, but the sorrow that clung to them was palpable, a weight that pressed against Elena's chest. As she watched, one of the shapes lifted a hand, a pale, trembling gesture that seemed to beckon her forward. The lantern's light trembled in response, the amber glow stretching and bending, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the stone. A sudden, sharp crack split the silence, a sound like a piece of timber snapping under the weight of an unseen force. The lantern above the staircase, long since dark, burst into a burst of cold, white light that illuminated the entire tower for a brief, blinding instant. In that flash, Elena saw the interior of the lantern room, the glass panes shattered, scattering like a flock of startled birds, and a figure stood at the center of the chaos. It was a man, gaunt and bent, his eyes hollow pits of despair. He wore a weather-worn coat that hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands were clasped around a rusted lantern that seemed to pulse with a faint, blood-red glow. His mouth opened, and a guttural cry rose from his throat, a sound that was both a warning and a plea, "Leave. Leave this place." The voice reverberated through the stone, echoing off each curve of the stairwell, filling the tower with a resonance that vibrated in Elena's bones. The light snapped back to darkness as quickly as it had erupted, and the phantom figure vanished, leaving only the two child silhouettes, now standing still, their heads bowed as if in prayer. The lantern in Elena's hand sputtered, the flame guttering before steadied once more, casting a soft, steady glow that seemed suddenly fragile. She pressed the recorder to her ear, listening to the playback of the night sounds. The tap on the stone remained, but now it was accompanied by a low, mournful lullaby, a melody that rose and fell like the tide, each note dripping with grief. The hum grew louder, forming words that Elena could not quite catch, but the sorrow was unmistakable. The wind outside rose, a low moan that seemed to echo the cadence of a child's lullaby, though no melody formed fully in her mind. A soft creak resonated from the stairwell, a single step landing on stone that was not her own. Elena's breath caught. She turned the lantern toward the source, the beam cutting a thin column of light that fell upon the darkened steps. Nothing moved, yet the air felt heavier, as if the tower itself exhaled a sigh. She recorded the sound, the faint tap followed by a faint, distant hum that might have been a child's voice, or merely the wind threading through the cracks. The recorder captured a low, mournful tone, a sound that would later be described by the team as the echo of a lullaby half forgotten. Elena closed her notebook, her mind already cataloging the sensations, the temperature, the faint sounds. She rose, her routine now altered by the subtle hint that the tower held more than stone and salt. The lighthouse, she realized, was a vessel of memory, and its walls were ready to speak. With a final glance at the journal, she descended the spiral stair, each step a measured beat in the rhythm of a story that had waited centuries to be heard. The wind that battered the cliffs had turned to a low, mournful howl, and the sea below thrashed against the rocks with a fury that seemed to echo the grief of the stone tower itself. Elena stood at the base of the lighthouse, the journal of Thomas Whitaker clutched in her trembling hands, its pages stained with salt and something darker. The research team had gathered around a weather-worn wooden table in the cramped kitchen of the keeper's quarters, the flickering light of a single oil lamp casting long shadows that danced like specters on the cracked plaster. "First we need the facts," Elena said, her voice barely rising above the hiss of the waves. "If there is a story, there must be a record. A name, a date, a warning. Something that can ground the legend in reality." She lifted the journal to the lamp, the thin beam catching the ink that had bled into the paper long ago. Whitaker's entries grew frantic in the days before the storm, his hand shaking as he described a night when the sea rose higher than any tide the town had ever known. He wrote of a fire that had started in the kitchen, of a scream that had been swallowed by the wind, and of two small figures, the twins, who had vanished from the loft where they had been kept. The team's historian, Marco, pulled a battered ledger from his satchel. It was the town's register of births, deaths, and shipwrecks, bound in cracked leather and stamped with the faded seal of St. Augustine's parish. He turned the pages with reverent care, each turn a soft rustle that seemed louder in the oppressive silence of the lighthouse. "Here," Marco whispered, pointing to a narrow column of ink. July 14, 1883. The schooner Mariner's Hope ran aground on the reef just north of the harbor. 2 survivors were rescued, a pair of orphaned girls, Amelia and Clara Whitaker, aged 7 and 8. The keeper's log notes that they were taken in, that the townsfolk offered prayers for their safety. Elena's eyes widened. The surname matched the journal's author, but the dates did not align. Thomas Whitaker could not have been the father, she murmured, but perhaps a relative. Or perhaps the name was altered to hide something. Marco flipped further, his finger landing on a thin, yellowed notice pinned to the margin of a council meeting record. The ink was smudged, the words barely legible, but the meaning was clear. The council has received reports of strange occurrences within the lighthouse. The keeper, Thomas Whitaker, is advised to cease all-night watches until the matter is investigated. The townsfolk have spoken of a curse that dwells where the sea meets stone. Any further disturbances shall be deemed a threat to the safety of the harbor. A shiver ran through Elena's spine. The council's warning was not a rumor, it was a documented decree, a formal acknowledgement that the lighthouse had become a place of dread. She traced the edge of the paper with a fingertip, feeling the roughness of the ink as if it might still hold the weight of the fear that had driven the council's hand. "Look at this," Marco said, pulling another sheet from beneath the ledger. It was a newspaper clipping, its headline faded but still legible, "Tragedy at the Light, 2 young lives lost." The article recounted the night of the storm, describing how a fire had broken out in the keeper's quarters, how the lighthouse's lantern had sputtered, and how, when the flames were finally subdued, the twins were nowhere to be found. The piece ended with a solemn warning: the sea claims what it will, but the lighthouse must stand as a beacon for those who still wander. Elena felt the weight of the words settle like a stone in her gut. The tragedy was not a ghost story whispered by fishermen, it was a recorded calamity, a loss that had been noted, mourned, and then buried beneath layers of salt and time. She turned the journal to the final entry, the one that had been left open, the ink still wet as if the keeper had written it moments before. His own breath left his body. "They are gone. I hear their cries in the walls. I hear the tide rise, and I hear my own heart beating against the stone. I pray the sea will take me, for I am unworthy of the light." Elena closed the journal with a soft thud that resonated through the wooden floorboards. She stood, the lamp's flame flickering as if in response to the weight of the truth she now held. The towers seemed to breathe around her, the stone walls exhaling a sigh that carried the faint echo of a lullaby, half forgotten and forever bound to the wind. She turned to the rest of the team, her eyes steady despite the tremor in her voice. "We have the records. The council warned us, the town mourned, and the keeper left his confession in ink. The curse is not a phantom of imagination, it is a wound in the history of this place. If we are to understand what haunts these stairs, we must follow the trail of the written word, the official notice, the newspaper, and the keeper's own remorse." Marco nodded, his fingers still tracing the faded ink. "The lighthouse is a vessel of memory," he said, "and its memory is heavy with sorrow. We must listen to it, not just with our ears, but with the mind that can sift truth from terror." Elena lifted the journal once more, the pages rustling like dry leaves in a storm. "Then let us begin," she declared, "by seeking the old lighthouse keeper's cabin, where the fire left its scar, and where the twins' footprints may still linger in the dust. We will find the truth, and perhaps, in doing so, lay their spirits to rest." The team gathered their equipment, the lantern's dim glow casting long shadows that stretched toward the spiral stairwell. As they stepped forward, the wind outside rose, a low moan that seemed to echo the cadence of a child's lullaby, and the stone tower, ancient and weary, waited for their next question: ready to answer with the whispers of its past. The night pressed against the stone like a weight, and the wind that howled over the surf seemed to carry a voice that was not its own. Elena had set the recorder on the iron rail of the spiral stair, its tiny red light blinking a steady heartbeat against the darkness. Marco adjusted the microphone, his fingers trembling as he tightened a cable that seemed to pulse with an unseen current. The air in the lantern room grew cold, the glass of the lantern shivering as if some invisible breath brushed its surface. They had been listening for hours, the only sounds the distant crash of waves and the creak of timber that had settled into the tower's bones. Then, without warning, the recorder captured a soft, wet sob. It rose and fell like the sigh of a child who could not find sleep, each gasp a thin thread of grief that stretched across the stone. The sound seemed to come from the very steps they were climbing, as if the stair itself were weeping. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Marco swallowed, his eyes darting to the darkness below. It's coming from the stairs." He pointed a trembling hand toward the winding path that vanished into blackness. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the lantern room, the sound of metal striking metal. The lantern's glass shattered in a spray of glittering shards that fell like frozen rain onto the wooden floor. A cold gust surged through the opening, carrying with it a smell of salt and ash, the scent of a fire long dead. The shards clattered, and in the brief flash of reflected light, a silhouette flickered on the wall, a figure bent, its shoulders hunched, a lantern held high as if pleading for salvation. Elena's recorder crackled, and a voice, ragged and desperate, burst through the static. "Leave. Leave this place." The words were raw, edged with a terror that seemed to claw at the very air. The voice belonged to a man, Thomas Whitaker, the keeper, yet it sounded older, as if time itself had stretched his cries into a wail that reverberated through the stone. "Who's there?" Marco demanded, his voice cracking. The words hung in the cold, swallowed by the tower's vast emptiness. A low, mournful lullaby rose from the darkness, the melody thin and broken, each note a tear that fell from some unseen child's eye. The tune wrapped itself around the spiraling steps, winding tighter with each repetition. The sound seemed to come from the attic above, where the keeper's quarters lay in ruin. It was a song Elena remembered from her childhood, a lullaby her mother sang when storms rattled the windows, yet here it was twisted, warped by sorrow, each phrase a plea for release. The recorder's red light flickered, then steadied, capturing the lullaby and the desperate shout. A sudden thump reverberated from the stairwell, the sound of a footfall that did not belong to any living being. The team's flashlights, which had been dimmed to preserve the night's ambience, sputtered to life, casting thin beams that cut through the black. The light fell upon a pair of small, ghostly footprints etched into the stone, the prints glowing faintly with an eerie phosphorescence. Elena stepped forward, her boots crunching on the dust-laden steps. The air grew heavier with each ascent, pressing against her chest as if the tower itself were inhaling. She reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed against the stone. It was warm, as if a hand had just been placed there moments before. A sudden rush of ash fell from the wall, coating her fingers in a fine, gray powder that smelled of burnt paper and seaweed. "Marco," she began, but her words were cut short by a sudden, violent gust that slammed the lantern door shut, the metal groaning in protest. The wind howled through the cracks, a sound that was not wind at all but a chorus of anguished cries. In the sudden darkness, a shape materialized at the base of the stairs, a tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by a veil of mist. The figure raised a hand, and a cold, clammy palm brushed Elena's cheek. The touch left a lingering imprint, a faint burn that tingled like a brand. The recorder emitted a high, keening whine, and the playback revealed a new layer of sound, a man's voice, strained and pleading, "Forgive me." It overlapped the children's sobbing, the keeper's shout, and the lullaby, creating a cacophony that threatened to shatter the mind. The tower seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, the stone walls breathing in rhythm with the recorded sounds. Marco clutched the recorder, his knuckles white. "We have to leave," he whispered, but his feet remained rooted, as if the very stairs were holding him in place. The staircase trembled, each step shifting as if alive, and a low rumble rose from the depths of the tower, a sound like a heart beating in the earth. Suddenly, the lantern's broken glass reassembled itself in a flash of spectral light, the shards snapping together as if guided by unseen hands. The lantern flared, casting a fierce beam that cut through the gloom, illuminating the stairwell in stark, white clarity. In that beam, the silhouette of the keeper stood at the top, his eyes hollow pits of darkness, his mouth open in a silent scream. Beside him, two faint shapes, tiny, translucent, the twins, hovered, their faces turned away, their hands reaching toward the light. The recorder crackled one final time, catching a whispered promise, "When the light returns, the tide will take us home." The tower shivered, and the wind that had howled moments before fell to a mournful sigh. The footsteps ceased, the lullaby faded, and a heavy silence settled over the stone. Elena lowered the recorder, her hands shaking. "We have them," she said, voice barely audible, as if fearing to disturb the fragile peace that had settled like a thin veil. Marco nodded, eyes fixed on the lantern's glow, the beam now steady, a thin line of hope cutting through the endless night. The tower, once a vessel of terror, seemed to exhale, its walls holding the echoes of grief, guilt, and the promise of redemption that lingered in the cold air. The night had settled like a heavy blanket, thick with the scent of salt and old stone. Elena had spent the afternoon hunched over the cracked journal, her fingers tracing the frantic scrawl of Thomas Whitaker, the last keeper. The words had driven her to a single, desperate thought: if the keeper had hidden something, perhaps a place of safety lay within the tower's womb, a refuge from the restless spirits that prowled its winding stairs. She rose from the wooden table in the keeper's quarters, the candlelight trembling against the walls. "Marco," she whispered, "there's a door behind the pantry. The journal mentions a hidden room, a place the keeper used when the storm grew too fierce. If we can find it, we might seal the spirits, or at least find a calm spot to set up the recorder without interference." Marco, his eyes still rimmed with the fatigue of the day's investigations, nodded. "If there is a hidden room, it could be our sanctuary. Let's move quickly before the tide climbs again." They slipped through the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking under their boots. The pantry was a cramped space, its shelves empty save for a few rusted tins and a broken lantern. Elena pressed her palm against the wall, feeling for any irregularity. Her fingers brushed a cold, metallic ring, an old latch concealed by a layer of grime. With a grunt, she pulled, and the wall shivered, then gave way in a slow, grinding sigh. A narrow passage yawned before them, its darkness swallowing the feeble candlelight. The air was colder here, as if the stone itself exhaled a breath of ancient frost. Elena led the way, her heart thudding in her throat, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. The passage opened into a small chamber, its ceiling low enough that Marco had to duck. The room was lined with stone slabs, each etched with faint, weathered symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim glow. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface scarred by years of fire and water. Upon the altar lay a rusted lantern, its glass cracked but its metal frame still whole. A thin veil of ash clung to the edges, as if something had brushed against it and left a ghostly imprint. Elena felt a sudden wave of relief wash over her. "We've found it," she breathed, her voice barely louder than the wind that whispered through the cracks in the stone. This is the keeper's safe place. If we light the lantern, perhaps we can draw the spirits here, bind them, and keep them from the stairs. She knelt beside the altar, lifting the lantern with reverent hands. The metal was cold, sending a shiver up her arm. Marco stepped forward, his flashlight cutting a thin slice of light through the gloom. He placed the recorder on the altar, its red light blinking weakly. "We'll record everything," he said, his tone steadier than he felt. "If anything happens, we'll have proof." Elena fumbled with the lantern's wick, coaxing a feeble flame from the remnants of the old oil. The flame sputtered, then steadied, casting a trembling amber glow that danced across the stone walls. For a moment, the chamber seemed to breathe with them, the oppressive weight of the tower lifting as the light grew. A soft, melodic hum rose from the shadows, a lullaby the girls had sung long ago. Elena's breath caught. The sound was sweet, innocent, and yet it carried a sorrow that pressed against her chest. She turned to Marco, expecting him to see the source, but his eyes were wide with terror. From the far corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the stone. It moved with a fluid grace, a dark silhouette that seemed to ripple like water. The shape grew taller, its form becoming unmistakably human, a figure draped in a tattered coat of a lighthouse keeper, his face hidden beneath a hood, his hands outstretched as if pleading. "Elena, Marco," the figure rasped, each word a scrape of rusted metal against stone. "You think this light will save you? You think this hidden room will keep you safe?" The lantern's flame flickered. Then surged, as if fed by an unseen wind. The light threw the keeper's ghost into sharp relief, his hollow eyes burning with a cold, ancient fire. Behind him, two smaller shapes emerged, the twin girls, their faces turned away, their mouths open in silent cries. A sudden, deafening crash reverberated through the chamber as the stone wall opposite the altar gave way. A cascade of rubble tumbled down, the dust choking Elena's lungs. The lantern, now bright with an angry blaze, slammed against the falling stones, shattering its glass into 1,000 glittering shards that rained like icy rain. The hidden room was no sanctuary. It was a trap, a coffin sealed by the very spirits they sought to bind. The walls, once solid, now groaned and shifted, the symbols etched upon them glowing with a malevolent light. The floor beneath their feet trembled, threatening to give way. Marco lunged for the recorder, but his hand slipped on the slick ash that coated the stone. He fell, the device clattering to the ground, its red light sputtering out. Elena scrambled to her feet, clutching the broken lantern, its flame now a wild, uncontrolled inferno that licked the stone and threatened to consume everything. The keeper's phantom raised his hand, and the ash that clung to Elena's cheek ignited, leaving a hot, burning mark that seared her skin. She felt the sting of fire and the cold of death at once, a paradox that tore at her senses. "Leave," the keeper screamed, his voice a chorus of wind and waves. "Leave this place before the tide claims you as it did the twins." The staircase beyond the hidden room roared to life, the spiral steps shaking as if the tower itself were rising to meet the sea. The storm outside battered the lighthouse with a ferocity that seemed to echo the fury within. The hidden chamber, once a promise of safety, now pulsed with the heartbeat of the tower's curse. Elena clutched the broken lantern, its flame dancing madly, and forced herself toward the narrow opening that led back to the stairs. The ash on her cheek burned, a reminder that the tower would not release its grip without a price. She could feel the weight of the keeper's guilt, the sorrow of the twins, and the cold hand of the sea pressing against the stone. As she stumbled onto the spiral steps, the lantern's light flickered, casting fleeting shadows of the twins on the walls, silhouettes that seemed to plead, to warn, to beg. The false relief of the hidden room dissolved into a deeper dread. The tower had offered a false haven, only to drag them deeper into its relentless, haunted maw. The hidden door behind the rust-stained cabinet had been a whisper in the stone, a thin seam of mortar that gave way only when Elena pressed the cold iron key into its heart. The latch gave a mournful sigh, and the wall swung inward on hinges that had not moved in a century. A breath of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of salt-worn wood and something sweeter, a faint perfume of wilted roses that seemed to bloom in the darkness. The chamber beyond was no larger than a coffin, its walls smothered in a thick black soot that clung to every surface like a living shroud. In the center of the room lay a cracked wooden crate, its lid half opened, revealing a tangle of blackened rope, a rusted lantern mantle, and a bundle of brittle papers. Elena knelt, her fingers trembling, and brushed the soot from the first page. The ink was smeared, the words jagged, as if written by a hand that had been shaking for weeks. June 12th, the storm came before the tide. The twins, Amelia and Clara, were restless, their cries echoing through the stone. I promised them safety, promised the light would guide them home. The fire in the kitchen leapt too high, the oil slicked the floor, and the heat rose like a living thing. I tried to pull them from the stairs, but the stairs were a serpent, coiling and collapsing beneath their tiny feet. The entry was followed by a frantic scrawl, ink blotting the margin, the writer's breath evident in each line. The doors would not open. The wind hammered the glass, the lantern flickered, and the sea roared as if it would swallow the tower whole. I heard their lullaby, soft, pleading, coming from the attic, but the sound was not theirs. It was the house itself, singing a song of loss. I could feel their small hands clutching my coat, their eyes wide with terror. A second page lay beneath, stained with a dark, coppery hue. Elena's heart hammered as she lifted the ragged edge. The stain spread, a rust-colored river across the paper, and beneath it the words emerged, as though the blood itself had written them. I could not bear the weight of their silence. I sealed the stairwell, locked the door, and hid the key in the keeper's chest. I placed the twins' photographs in the box, hoping the stone would keep their faces safe. I lit the lantern one last time, hoping the beam would carry their souls out to sea, but the flame guttered and died. Their cries turned to whispers, and the whispers turned to a scream that still haunts these walls. Elena turned the page with a shaking hand. The next entry was a crude drawing, a rough, trembling sketch of two small figures, their arms outstretched, their faces a blur of tears. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence, scratched into the paper as if the writer had used his fingernails: "Forgive me, my girls, for I have become the darkness they feared." The final document was a sealed envelope, its wax stamp broken. Inside lay a photograph, torn at the edges, the glass of the lens cracked. The twins' faces stared back, eyes wide, mouths open in a silent scream. Their hair was matted with seaweed, their dresses stained with a dark, oily sheen. Behind them, the stone stairwell loomed, its steps jagged and broken, the very heart of the tower where the fire had licked the wood and the ash had settled like a funeral shroud. Elena felt the stone pulse beneath her feet, as if the tower itself were a beating heart, each throb a reminder of the night the fire had swallowed the stairwell and the sea had claimed the twins. The air grew thicker, the soot seemed to rise and swirl, forming shapes that whispered in a language older than any living tongue. The walls closed in, the narrow passage narrowing to a slit of light that flickered like a dying candle. She heard a low, guttural moan, a sound that was neither wind nor wave, but the mournful wail of a man who had watched his own salvation burn. The voice rose, trembling, echoing through the cramped chamber, each syllable a crack in the stone: "Leave, leave, before the tide, before the darkness." Elena pressed the lantern mantle to her chest, the ash on her cheek burned like a brand. The weight of the keeper's guilt pressed upon her, a cold hand that seemed to tighten around her throat. She could feel the twins' sorrow, a cold, relentless tide that lapped at the edges of her mind, threatening to pull her under. The stone floor beneath her seemed to shift, the stairs above trembling as if the tower itself were preparing to collapse. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale tasting of salt and smoke. She could see, in the dim glow of the broken lantern, the faint outline of the twin silhouettes, their forms wavering like candle flames caught in a gale, their eyes pleading for release. A sudden, sharp crack rang through the chamber, the lantern's glass, already fractured, shattered completely, scattering shards that glittered like frozen tears. The sound reverberated, a final note in the tower's mournful symphony. The ash on Elena's cheek drifted away, carried by a gust that seemed to rise from the very depths of the sea, as if the ocean itself were reaching up to claim what remained of the cursed stone. She fell to her knees, the key clattering to the floor, its metal glinting like a promise of redemption. In that cramped, suffocating space, Elena understood the full weight of the legend. The keeper had not merely failed his charge, he had become the very darkness that held the twins in perpetual torment. The tower was a tomb, its stairs a spiral of grief that looped forever, and the only way to break the cycle was to let the light blaze one last time, to let the sea claim the flame and the souls it had stolen. With trembling hands, Elena lifted the lantern mantle, feeling the heat of the dying ember against her palm. The ash fell away, leaving a clean, cold cheek, and the stone seemed to sigh, as if a breath had finally been released. The tower, still trembling, waited for the final act, an act that would either seal the curse forever or unleash it upon the world beyond the cliffs. The night had already swallowed the cliffs, a black maw that pressed against the stone of the lighthouse. The wind howled through the broken windows, a mournful choir that seemed to carry the breath of the sea itself. Elena, clutching the rusted key and the blood-stained mantle, felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes upon her as she stepped onto the narrow landing that spiraled upward like a throat of a dying beast. A sudden crack split the air, the lantern glass shattering in a spray of glittering shards that fell like frozen rain onto the stone floor. From the darkness beyond the broken pane, a shape emerged, tall, gaunt, draped in the tattered uniform of a keeper long dead. Thomas Whitaker's phantom stood at the foot of the stairs, his face a mask of ash and sorrow, his eyes twin pits of endless night. He raised a trembling hand, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so sharply that Elena's breath formed a thin veil before her. "Leave! Leave this place," the keeper's voice roared, a sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of the ocean. It was not a plea but a command, a warning that vibrated through bone and marrow. The sound of his voice cracked the stone, and the spiral stairs began to tremble, each step groaning under an unseen weight. From the attic above, a faint lullaby rose, a melody once sung to soothe the twin girls, now twisted into a dirge of desperation. The notes floated down the shaft like a ghostly wind, wrapping around Elena's mind, pulling at the threads of her sanity. The song grew louder, the voices of Amelia and Clara overlapping, their tones pleading, their words lost to time, but their sorrow unmistakable. The phantom keeper surged forward, his form flickering like a candle caught in a storm. With each step he took, the stone seemed to weep, droplets of black ichor seeping from the cracks, staining the floor. He reached out, his skeletal fingers brushing the air where Elena stood, and a rush of cold ash brushed her cheek, leaving a lingering imprint that burned with the memory of his guilt. "Do you not see what you have done?" The girls' voices rose together, a chorus of accusation that filled the tower. "Our blood stains the stone. Our cries are the wind." Their silhouettes flickered on the walls, twin flames of pale light that danced in time with the storm's fury. The images swirled, forming the shape of the two sisters, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in a silent scream. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the lantern mantle pulsing against her palm, as if the dying ember within still clung to life. The key in her hand vibrated, a low hum that seemed to sync with the rhythm of the storm outside. She understood, in a flash of terror, that the only way to end this night was to give the light back to the sea, to let the flame burn through the darkness and carry the sisters' souls away. She turned to the staircase, but the phantom keeper blocked her path, his form expanding, filling the narrow passage with a wall of blackness. "You will not," he hissed, and the words dissolved into a scream that rattled the lantern room's iron beams. The tower shook, and a thunderclap cracked the sky, a bolt of white fire striking the sea below. The impact sent a surge of wind up the cliff, tearing at the lighthouse's bones. The lantern glass, already shattered, sent shards spiraling outward like a hail of glass teeth. The phantom's outline wavered, his form cracking like old plaster under the storm's wrath. "Enough!" Elena shouted, her voice raw and hoarse. She thrust the mantle forward, the ember within flaring bright enough to blind even the darkest night. The flame leapt, licking the iron frame, igniting the oil that had lain dormant for decades. A fierce blaze erupted, a column of golden fire that surged upward, consuming the shattered lantern and spilling into the spiral stairwell. The heat was a wave that washed over the keeper's spectre, turning his ash-filled form to smoke that rose in thin ribbons, twisting and dissipating into the night. The sisters' silhouettes flickered one last time, their faces softening, their eyes reflecting a peace that had never been theirs. A final note of the lullaby rose, pure and bright, then fell silent as the flame reached its apex. The tower trembled, the stone groaning as if relieved of a great burden. The wind, now a roaring gale, slammed the doors shut, sealing the lighthouse from the storm outside. Elena felt the ground beneath her shift, the spiral stairs collapsing in a cascade of dust and debris, the staircase itself giving way like a dying heart. She ran, the heat of the lantern still scorching her skin, the ash on her cheek finally gone, replaced by a thin film of soot. The stairwell collapsed behind her, a wall of stone and fire that sealed the phantom keeper forever. The lighthouse, its beam now a fierce, unyielding blaze, cut through the blackness, a beacon that pierced the night and the sea alike. Behind her, the wind carried the last echo of the girl's lullaby, now a whisper that blended with the roar of the waves. The tower stood, its light blazing, the darkness that once held the twins within its stone now forced into the sea's endless abyss. Elena staggered onto the crumbling balcony, the storm raging around her, but the terror that had haunted the lighthouse was finally broken, its power shattered by the flame she had dared to rekindle. The wind howled like a wounded beast as the storm rolled in from the Atlantic, black clouds swallowing the horizon and the sea thrashing against the jagged rocks below. Elena stood at the base of the spiral stair, the iron railing slick with rain, her breath a thin plume that vanished the instant it left her lips. The research team, Mara, Jonah, and Luis, had gathered their gear, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the ancient stone that rose like a wounded sentinel against the night. The lantern room waited at the summit, its glass dome cracked and clouded by years of neglect, the great Fresnel lens still in place, its copper ribs rusted but intact. In the keeper's log, Thomas Whitaker had written of a night when the sea rose higher than the tower's walls, when fire licked the wooden beams, and when the twins' laughter turned to screams. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, "The girls, the tide. I cannot," and then nothing. Elena felt the weight of those words settle upon her shoulders. She tightened the straps of her harness, the rope coiled around her waist, and placed a single, weather-worn step onto the first rung. The stone beneath her foot was cold, damp, and seemed to pulse with a faint, mournful rhythm, as if the tower itself remembered the cries that once echoed through its hollow heart. "Listen," whispered Mara, her voice barely audible over the roar of the surf. You can hear them still, soft, like a lullaby carried on the wind. A faint melody drifted up the stairwell, a trembling tune that seemed to rise from the very walls, each note a trembling thread of sorrow. Jonah lifted the portable recorder, its red light blinking in the gloom. "We need to capture this," he said, his hands shaking. The recorder crackled, catching the distant hum of the sea and the faint, ethereal song that grew louder with each step they climbed. The stairs narrowed, the walls closing in like the ribs of a giant, breathing beast. Drops of water fell from the ceiling, striking the stone with a soft patter that mixed with the wind's howl. Elena's heart hammered, each beat echoing in her ears louder than the next. She could feel an unseen presence watching, a cold hand brushing the back of her neck, leaving a fleeting imprint of ash that tingled like an old wound. Halfway up, a sudden crash reverberated through the tower. A rusted lantern, long since extinguished, fell from a ledge and shattered against the stone, scattering shards that glittered like tiny stars in the dim light. The sound was a warning, a scream of glass that seemed to summon the phantom keeper from the shadows. "Keep moving," Luis urged, his voice steadier than his trembling hands. "We must reach the lantern room before the tide swallows us whole." The final flight of stairs opened into the lantern room, a vaulted chamber of weather-stained glass and ironwork. The great lamp stood at its center, its brass frame corroded, the mantle blackened by soot and blood. In the corner, a rusted key lay on a broken wooden bench, its teeth twisted, as if it had been turned too many times in desperation. Elena approached the lamp, her fingers trembling as she lifted the key and turned it in the lock. The click was deafening in the silence that followed, and the mantle ignited with a sudden, fierce flame. The fire roared to life, licking the glass panes, casting a golden blaze that cut through the darkness like a blade of hope. The beam surged outward, sweeping across the storm-tossed sea, its light a white spear that pierced the black clouds. As the lantern shone, the air in the room grew thin, and a shape began to coalesce in the corner where the twins had once slept. Amelia and Clara's silhouettes flickered upon the stone walls, their forms translucent, their eyes hollow yet filled with a desperate yearning. "Release us," the older sister seemed to whisper, her voice a sigh that blended with the wind. The younger twin reached out, her hand passing through the air, touching nothing but the cold stone. In that instant, the phantom of Thomas Whitaker materialized, his gaunt face twisted in anguish, his eyes reflecting the lantern's fire. He raised a trembling hand, as if to clutch at the flame, then dropped it, his voice a hollow echo that rang through the tower. "Forgive me," the words hung in the air, trembling like a dying chord. The lantern's beam intensified, flooding the room with a blinding white that seemed to burn away the lingering shadows. The ghost of the keeper shrank, his form dissolving into a spray of ash that swirled with the wind, carried out through the cracked windows and into the night. The twin silhouettes flickered one last time, their faces softening, a faint smile breaking the sorrow that had bound them for decades. The storm outside surged, the sea hurling itself against the base of the tower, but the light from the lantern held firm, a steadfast beacon against the chaos. Elena felt a sudden calm settle over her, the weight of the tower's grief lifting as the flame burned bright. The lullaby that had haunted the stairwell faded, its notes turning into the whisper of the wind, a reminder that the tragedy had finally been set free. The team stood in stunned silence, the lantern's glow bathing their faces, the storm's fury raging beyond the glass. The lighthouse, once a prison of sorrow, now shone with a purpose renewed. Elena glanced back at the spiral stair, the stone now still, the echo of the girl's song gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of the sea and the promise of a new dawn. The first pale fingers of dawn slipped over the battered stone of St. Augustine Lighthouse, spilling light into a tower that had known only night for a century. The storm had spent its fury, leaving a slick of foam that clung to the base like a shivering veil. Inside, the lantern room glowed with a steady, amber pulse, the flame that Elena and the others had coaxed back to life still dancing against the wind-scarred glass. They stood in a circle, faces illuminated by the warm glow, breath fogging in the cold air that lingered despite the sun's approach. The sea's roar had softened to a distant murmur, a lullaby of waves that seemed almost human in its rhythm. Elena felt the weight of the tower lift, as if the stone itself exhaled after a long, held breath. "Is it over?" whispered Marco, his voice raw with exhaustion. Elena turned her gaze to the spiral stairwell, its stone walls now smooth, untouched by the frantic clatter of the night before. No longer did the shadows flicker with the twin silhouettes, no more did the mournful lullaby echo from the attic. For a heartbeat, it seemed the lighthouse had finally been cleansed. She lifted her eyes to the lantern's glass, watching the beam cut a clean line through the gray sky. It reached out, a finger of light grasping at the darkness beyond, as if trying to pull something back from the abyss. The beam fell upon the sea, striking the black water with a thin, white scar. In that scar, for a fleeting second, Elena thought she saw a shape, something that moved against the tide, a dark silhouette that rose and fell like a breathing thing. A sudden chill brushed her cheek, colder than any draft the tower had ever offered. She turned, expecting the phantom of the keeper to appear, but the room was empty. Yet the lantern's flame flickered, sputtering as if a breath had passed through it. "Did you feel that?" asked Lila, her hand trembling as she clutched the recorder that had captured the night's cries. The device sat on the metal table, its red light blinking faintly. She pressed play, and the thin speaker hissed a low, distorted voice, "Leave this place." The words were garbled, but the urgency was clear, a warning that had once rung through the stone. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the glass. The surface was warm, the heat of the flame seeping through the metal. As she pressed her palm to it, a sudden, sharp crack split the air. The lantern's glass shattered, shards scattering like glass snow across the floor. The flame sputtered, then flared, a sudden blaze that threw the room into a harsh, white glare. In that blinding flash, Elena saw them, not the twins, not the keeper, but a third figure standing at the foot of the stairs. It was a child, no more than 5, with hair the color of seafoam and eyes that reflected the lantern's light like twin moons. The child's mouth was open in a silent scream, and from its throat poured a stream of black water that soaked the stone, spreading like ink. The water pooled, forming a dark vortex that seemed to drink the very light. The lantern's flame was drawn toward it, the fire licking the black tide as if it were a hungry mouth. Elena tried to step back, but the floor gave way beneath her feet. She felt herself falling, not through the stairs, but through a void of cold, endless night. She landed on cold stone, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The lighthouse was no longer a tower of stone but a cavern of endless corridors, each lined with the faces of the drowned, eyes wide, mouths open in perpetual cries. The twin silhouettes floated above, their forms twisted, their smiles now grotesque, their hands clasped around the necks of unseen victims. A voice rose, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You lit the light, but you cannot banish the tide. The sea takes what it claims, and the keeper's guilt is but a tide that never ebbs." Elena turned, heart hammering, to see the keeper standing before her, his uniform drenched, his face a hollow mask of ash. In his hand he clutched a rusted key, the same key they had found in the hidden compartment. He thrust it toward her, and as his fingers brushed hers, a surge of cold shot through her veins. The key dissolved into ash, spiraling upward, merging with the lantern's flame that now burned with a blue, otherworldly hue. The child's black water surged higher, filling the cavern, rising to the ceiling, and then, in a sudden, violent rush, it burst through the stone, spilling out into the real world. The sea beyond the lighthouse roared louder than ever, waves crashing against the base with a ferocity that seemed to tear the very foundation from the earth. Elena was pulled back, gasping, as the tower's doors slammed shut. The lantern's flame flickered one last time, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the distant, unending lullaby, now a low, guttural chant that seemed to rise from the depths of the ocean itself. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, the team gathered in the lantern room, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. The lantern lay shattered on the floor, its glass scattered like a broken mirror. The ash from the keeper's form had settled into a thin, gray dust that coated every surface. Elena stared at the stone stairwell, now empty, but she could feel a presence there, a weight pressing against the back of her mind. The recorder on the table whirred to life on its own, playing a new voice, soft, childlike, but tinged with a cold that cut to the bone. "Thank you for lighting the way," the voice whispered. "Now we can finally see." A cold wind swept through the tower, carrying with it the faint scent of brine and rot. Elena realized, with a horror that froze her blood, that the lantern had not been a beacon for the dead, but a lantern for the sea itself. By reigniting its flame, they had not freed the twins, they had opened a wound in the world, allowing the ocean's hunger to pour through the stone. The tower trembled, stones cracking, as a deep, resonant groan rose from the foundation. The sea, now a living thing, surged up the stairs, flooding the lower levels with black water that seeped into every crevice. The team could hear the distant, unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the flood, mingling with the keeper's desperate cries. Elena felt the cold water rise to her ankles, then her knees, and she understood, with a dread that would haunt her forever, that the lighthouse was not a monument to guide ships home, but a trap, a mouth waiting to swallow any who dared to bring its light back to life. The last thing she saw before the water engulfed her was the twins' faces, now twisted into snarls, their eyes reflecting the endless, hungry sea. The tower stood, its stone walls cracked, its lantern shattered, but its heart, an ancient, unquenchable hunger, beat on, waiting for the next storm, the next light, the next soul to lure into the depths. The wind carried the lullaby away, but the echo of the children's cruel chant lingered, a promise that the tragedy would never end, and that the sea would always claim what was offered to it.